1.3 billion, that's Mozart's number, or more precisely, of his heartbeats. In December 1791, after 35 years of uninterrupted activity, it stopped. 35 years of faithful service, beating the rhythm without pause. 35 years during which this tiny muscle, barely 300 grams, performed approximately 1,300,000,000 beats. A number that in itself is of absolutely no interest, unless you compare it with the average number of beats performed by the heart of an elephant, a pig, or a cat. Or a horse. Or even a rabbit. Which are all strangely close in magnitude to that of the great composer, as if, despite the diversity of built-in metronomes, there was some reason for them to seize up after a given number of beats. Why do we get such similar numbers when comparing species with very different life expectancies? Could the thumb be a countdown given to us from the start, meaning that for everyone, the finish line is somewhere around 1,000,000,000? To be sure, let's compare the number of heartbeats over a lifetime between two mammals that seem completely different, a blue whale and a hamster. The first has a heart rate estimated at 15 beats per minute. And it can live for nearly a century. That gives us something like 800 million heartbeats in total. The second has a heart that beats at around 450 beats per minute, but only lives for about 3 years on average. And over its short life, you get roughly 710 million heartbeats in total. Although these two mammals have very different internal rhythms, their total heartbeats are surprisingly similar. In fact, you could have fun doing this calculation for any mammal. No matter its lifespan, its size, or the rate at which its heart beats at rest, you would always end up with an order of magnitude around 1,000,000,000. Tell me your pulse, and I'll roughly predict your lifespan. In the 1940s, the biologist Max Kleiber noticed that there seemed to be a link among most vertebrates between the size of the animal, its lifespan, and its metabolism. That is, the amount of energy it needs at rest to stay alive. Kleiber, who was getting to the heart of the matter, noticed that the smaller an animal is, the more energy it needs to breathe, keep its brain and heart working, or maintain its body temperature. Since small animals need more energy, they live life at full speed, burning through their reserves and calories faster just to stay alive. And when energy needs increase, the heart rate follows, because the machine has to keep running. There's a relationship between heart rate and longevity. The two seem to be closely linked, except that heart activity is just one marker among others, reflecting the pace of a more global activity. And the billion mark doesn't just correspond to the wear and tear of the heart, but to that of the entire organism. On the other hand, large animals have a much slower metabolism and take longer to reach the billion beat zone. Although it's not necessary to be large in size to slow down your metabolism, as proven by certain species of bats, whose heart rate can drop from 45 beats per minute to just about 10 during hibernation. And they can live up to 40 years, living 70 times longer than their cousins that don't hibernate. Obviously, Kleiber's law doesn't explain everything. It generally works very well for mammals. For example, it doesn't explain why rodents and birds of the same weight have different lifespans, or why great apes, which reach 1 to 1.5 billion, differ from much heavier mammals. Sapiens is also a bit of an exception in this story, unless you die in your 30s, like Mozart. Modern humans average not 1, but 3 billion. However, Kleiber's law suggests we should stop at about 30 years old. A life expectancy that was on average that of men until the 18th century, when improvements in hygiene and advances in medicine gradually changed things, a bit quietly and a bit with music. Because it was discovered that mice who received heart transplants survive on average 27 days if they are made to listen to Verdi's La Traviata, and only 7 if they are subjected to silence. By the way, in our case, the heart is surprisingly discreet and silent. Most of the time we don't hear it. It works silently, averaging 100,000 beats per day. You try not to live at 100 miles an hour, but from the heart's point of view, you're already at 4,000. In the case of a long life of 39 years like that of Chopin, this little muscle that never sleeps has pumped enough blood to half fill the Church of the Madeleine, where the artist's funeral was held. No one knows if Chopin would have liked the image, especially since his heart was removed per his wishes, placed in a crystal jar of cognac, and put into a pillar of the Holy Cross Church in Warsaw. That leaves me speechless. The silence of the heart, on the other hand, comes from our brain, which masks its sensation, except during sustained physical effort, or moments of great emotion, excitement, fear, or heartbreak. Studies show that in elderly couples together for years, the risk of heart attack doubles in the 30 days after losing a loved one. And in the case of a painful breakup, some people can be struck by the so-called broken heart syndrome, which manifests as a feeling of heaviness in the chest. This is due to our immune defenses going into overdrive, reaching a level 3 times higher than that of a person who has actually had a heart attack and 34 times higher than normal. In this case, time remains the best remedy, and one might be tempted to envy Rana sylvatica, a small wood frog that, in winter, lets its heart become partially frozen to the point where it stops completely, as if put on pause. To do this frog has blood loaded with glucose, which prevents cell damage during crystallization and freezing. All that's left is to wait for it to pass, until the ice melts. Afterwards, if despite everything you still can't let it go, just remember that sponges have no heart, no brain, in fact no organs at all, and yet they're still alive. A small consolation. And since this episode is starting to make no sense at all, I think it's a good thing I'm not a shrimp. That would put my heart in my head, right next to my brain. The organ is even visible through their shell in some species, and no one knows if they can feel a blow to their heart. Maybe that's why heartbreak gives them a headache. Anyway, the heart doesn't stop on command, even if you wanted it to, because our cardiac muscle is self-activating. It doesn't go through the central system. It can't be controlled. Unless you're a Galapagos iguana, which, when faced with danger, like the presence of a shark for example, is actually able to simply stop its heart to make itself less noticeable. And the longest pause ever recorded was 45 minutes of silence. 3 billion thanks to everyone who has a hand in this and who supports us on Typee. You can now support us with crypto. Details are in the description. Also, since we just got Instagram, let's listen to the silence from an iguana's heart.